dead of night, Glenrowan, Australia. Constable Hugh Bracken lies tossing in bed. Fever runs through him. He begins to drift off when a sudden banging jars him awake. Somebody's at the door. He can barely think straight, but he stumbles slowly to unlock it. The second he does, the door slams open. A giant man in metal armor pushes through and puts a gun to the police officer's head. A voice echoes from inside the tall helmet. "I'm Ned Kelly. Bail up or you're a dead man." I am Ned Kelly. For years, those words struck fear into the hearts of everybody living in the Australian colony of Victoria. Fear and a little excitement. Newspapers filled up with shocking details about his crimes, eager gossip from those who met him, and abject scorn for the police force which failed to catch so much as a glimpse of him over a multi-year manhunt that cost the government thousands of pounds in manpower and equipment. Rogue or hero, murderer or angel of vengeance, he was then, and still is today, a divisive figure in the Australian landscape. To some, he was a brave warrior, standing up to a corrupt police force that served only to protect a rigged financial system. To others, he was no more than a murderer who endangered the lives of innocents in his reckless quest for revenge. As for Ned Kelly, he wanted people to listen to his story and judge for themselves. He said, "I do not pretend to have led a blameless life, or that one fault justifies another. But the public, in judging a case like mine, should remember that the darkest life may have a bright side." So, let's hear his story. May of 1865. 6 children huddled next to their mother and watched the police constable clap handcuffs onto their father, John Kelly, before leading him away. The biting winds that swept across their barren farm soon forced the family to retreat inside for warmth, all except the eldest boy, Ned. He stayed and watched until the policeman led his father out of sight. Ned loved his father. He was proud of him as only a child can be. He saw the good John Kelly, whom everybody called Red, for obvious reasons. Red had stolen pigs to feed his brothers and sisters back in Ireland, and for his crime he'd been transported to Australia. He had served his time in an Australian labor camp, married a vivacious Irish girl named Ellen, and did his best to scratch out a living for his ever-growing young family. But Red's best was never good enough. His business ventures fell through, his farmland proved rocky and untenable, and the city that he'd staked his hopes on became a ghost town as the Australian gold rush left it behind. Faced with the same pressure that had driven him to steal food for his family back in Ireland, Red did it again, and was caught again. That was the day Ned watched his father walk away in handcuffs. A few days later, Red was sentenced to 6 months hard labor. And so, at 11 years old, Ned suddenly became the man of the house. He dropped out of school and took on the role with vigor, determined to make his father proud. He looked after his pregnant mother, he tended the farm and the house as best he could. One day, on his way to town to pick up a few things, disaster nearly strikes. A 7-year-old boy, daydreaming on his way to school, drops his hat into the recently flooded river. When he reaches down to retrieve it, he falls. The river sweeps him away. And the only other person in sight is Ned Kelly. Ned doesn't lose a second. He races down to the river and jumps in. He barely knows how to swim, but he's big for his age, made strong by his work on the farm, and he throws himself into the current. Through sheer determination, Ned catches the boy. He pulls him back to shore, then he leads him, soaked and shivering, back home. The boy's parents shower Ned with gratitude. They even arrange a small ceremony where they present him with a broad green silk sash with shining gold tassels, the colors of Ireland. It is the finest piece of cloth Ned has ever touched, and when they drape it over his shoulders and call him a hero, he nearly bursts with pride. Ned would wear his trophy for weeks, inviting everybody he knew to touch it and hear the story of how brave he'd been. And best of all, wouldn't his father be proud? Red Kelly was proud. Proud, but no longer the man he had once been. The spark of determination had faded from his eyes. When he finally returned from his sentence of hard labor, he was a broken man who could only get through his days by drinking. Over the next year, Ned watched his father rot away and finally die from a failing liver in 1866, living just long enough to spend one final Christmas with his family, only to die before the new year. It was then that Ellen Kelly, Ned's mother, took matters into her own hands. Now a widow with 7 children, she had no family nearby except for a quarrelsome sister-in-law. But to the northeast, she had two sisters of her own that also needed someone to lean on. Both of their husbands still lived, but had been imprisoned for cattle stealing. So Ellen joined forces with them in the small town of Greta. Bit by bit, she saved up enough to rent her family a new house. It went cheap because nobody else wanted it, but to the dirt poor Kelly family, anything would do. Ned threw all of his energy into making a real farm out of it, but all he got for his trouble was blistered and tired. The only money he could squeeze out of it was chopping up trees for firewood and selling them in town, and not for very much. His family depended on him, and he didn't know what he could do. Enter Harry Power. Harry Power was a bushranger, the last of a dying breed of Australian outlaws and highwaymen, whose adventures always seemed so grand and romantic, up until the moment they got caught. Power had escaped from the same prison where Ned's uncles, the cattle thieves, had been locked up, and it was on their recommendation that he made his way to Greta and met Ned Kelly. What stories he told! He'd swept his way northeast on a whirlwind of robberies, rolling up as much as 87 pounds in a single day. Ned had never seen that much money in his life. He shook hands with Power and agreed to become his apprentice. Unfortunately, Power's grand criminal stories were a wee bit exaggerated. Oh, he had robbed his way through the north, sure enough, but he neglected to mention that he was actually pretty new at this bushranging thing himself. The prison sentence that he'd escaped had been for horse thieving, not for robbing real live people. And once he'd made his escape, a few months before they would have let him out anyway, Harry Power had looked around and thought, well, I'm hanged if they catch me now. Might as well go bushranger, I guess. Thus began Harry Power's storied career. He proceeded to rob people by shouting loudly and waving his gun around, but he never actually shot anyone. In fact, two of his would-be victims had actually captured him, but Powers convinced them to let him go. Not exactly a master criminal. So it's not much surprise that his first scheme, stealing fresh horses from one of the richest and most powerful men in the area, doesn't go quite as planned. Or maybe it's more like the planning itself doesn't go well. Power leads his new apprentice to a rocky bluff that overlooks the rich man's paddock, and they survey the land in preparation for a raid. One tiny problem, they're in plain sight, and they get seen. While they lie there, planning to steal them some horses, the owner saddles one of the horses they aren't watching, sneaks up around them, and fires a warning shot at Ned. The bullet drives into the ground inches in front of Ned's nose, sending a spray of gravel into the boy's face. He screams, flattening himself like a pancake, and starts gibbering about a surrender. Ned is not exactly a master criminal either at this point. But Harry Power refuses to leave him behind. If he lets anything happen to that boy, Ellen Kelly will straight up murder him. Cursing and hitting, he hauls Ned back on his feet and pulls him away before their pursuer can load and fire again. They run back to the horses they'd brought with them, not as good as the horses they were planning to steal, but good enough if you're desperate and willing to ride at breakneck speed, which they are. They gallop across rough and rocky territory that would have killed any lesser horseman, but whatever their shortcomings, neither of them is a lesser horseman. Ned races all the way home, leaps off his horse, and vows never to go bushranging again. Join us next time as Ned goes bushranging again. Returning from his brief time as a bushranger, Ned found his family in an even worse spot than before. The farm was still failing, his siblings had dropped out of school, his mother's new fiancé had abandoned her after getting her pregnant, and his maternal grandfather, the only member of the family who had ever done well in Australia, died, leaving the family defenseless against a rich neighbor who was trying to get them thrown off their land. After another year of struggling to make ends meet, Ned reached out to the only man he knew who seemed to be doing well, Harry Power. He left home and turned bushranger again. Harry Power had gotten a lot better at this bushranging thing now that he had more experience. He and Ned became a terror across the countryside, adding so many crimes to their ledger that police began to wonder if there could really only be two of them. In desperation, the police put a 500-pound bounty for the capture of Harry Power. A man could do honest work for 10 years and not bring home that much. And that temptation tipped Ned's Uncle Jack over the edge. He had been a friend to Power when they were in prison together. In fact, he'd been the one who had told Power about this area in the first place. But now Jack secretly approached the police as an informant, and they began laying a trap. It was pure good luck that Ned fell into their hands even before the trap could be sprung. Feeling sick and tired, and especially sick and tired of Harry Power bossing him around, Ned retreated home to be with his family for a while. But he'd barely settled down in his own bed when the police kicked the door open and dragged him to prison. Good old Uncle Jack might have been a traitor to his friend, but not to his family. He insisted that the police let the boy go, or he would not bring them Harry Power. And they agreed. Evidence and witnesses against Ned mysteriously disappeared, and they even treated him to the unique luxury of a hotel room to keep him out of the way while they went to catch Harry Power. Ned didn't understand why he'd been treated to such magnificence. Until they threw Harry Power in prison. Suddenly, the generous treatment he'd received from the police became a curse. Everybody, including Power, believed that Ned had turned traitor to protect himself. And while he might have gotten off the hook this time, Ned was still a criminal, and the local constable was determined to catch him at something. On April 20th, 1871, the constable would get his chance. A family friend had stopped by the Kelly farm, borrowing one of their horses and leaving his own for Ned to look after. She was a real beauty, a glowing chestnut mare who moved so smoothly you could fall asleep right on her back. Ned absolutely doted on her. He'd learned to ride on his mother's lap and loved horses more than life itself, but he rarely got to touch a horse like this one. He groomed her till she shone like gold, and rode her into town to keep her exercised and fit, and yeah, to show off a little bit. But when the constable sees him parading through town on a beautiful horse, he thinks, that is too fine a beast for the likes of Ned Kelly. He calls the boy aside, but the second Ned steps down, the officer leaps at him and shouts, "You are my prisoner for horse stealing." The horse spooks, and the constable misses his jump. Ned's first thought is for the horse. He's got to catch her before she runs loose and harms herself. So he runs after her. But the constable thinks he's trying to run away. He pulls out a gun and orders Ned to stop and face him. Ned obeys, only to find a gun already pointed at his head. Now, he hasn't done anything but borrow a horse from a family friend. What is this officer doing, threatening to kill him over it? "Shoot me and be damned," he yells. The officer shoots. A puff of smoke. The gun fails to fire. Panicked, the constable pulls the trigger again. Click. He steps forward for a better shot. Click. He starts shaking with fear, and before he can fire a fourth time, Ned grabs the gun and tries to wrestle it free. The constable won't let go, so Ned trips him and pins him to the ground. Now, Ned knows better than to hit a cop, but he can't take his chances on another shot being fired at him. Bystanders come rushing to help, pulling Ned off the man. The officer takes his gun back and slams it into Ned's forehead 5 times. It opens a gash so bloody that his superiors would later warn him to stop recklessly causing medical expenditure the next time he breaks the head of an Irishman. And of course, it turns out the horse was stolen, just not by Ned. His family friend had failed to mention that tiny little detail, and Ned had had no idea. Of course, neither had the police officer when he'd fired his revolver at Ned, or when he'd pistol-whipped him, or when he had locked him in a prison cell. But by the time Ned appeared at his trial, a police report about the stolen horse had magically appeared. The fact that it was dated 5 days after Ned Kelly's arrest didn't stop the officer from citing this report as the reason he had come after the boy. This time, the judge sent Ned away for 3 years hard labor. When the actual horse thief was caught a few weeks later, he only got half the sentence. It seemed that being a Kelly and a former friend of Harry Power were crimes not listed on the books. Despite it all, Ned emerged from his second jail sentence determined to turn things around. But he was immediately tested. He came home to discover that his 14-year-old brother had been caught stealing 5 cows and had been given 5 years in prison, the harshest sentence ever given to somebody that young. Another cop had begun tracking his family's every move and had gotten so close to them in the process that he'd started an affair with Ned's sister. When she'd gotten pregnant, he'd left, taking half the family's horses with him. The sister and her baby had died. After hearing this news, Ned grit his teeth, collected his things, and set off to find honest work. His past haunted him. Many employers shied away from hiring an ex-convict, and where he could find work, his coworkers either feared him or tried to start fights with him to prove how much tougher they were than this one-time bushranger. Ned kept a level head. He built a new reputation as a quiet, honest man, one who would help stop a bar fight, and who always kept his word. Even his worst detractors had to admit that no man could work harder or better than he. But even 3 years in, police suspicion continued to dog Ned and his family. He lost track of how many times he'd woken up in the middle of the night with a police officer banging on their door, accusing Ned of stealing some local cow or horse that had gone missing. All Ned's life, he and his family had struggled to make ends meet on their broken-down, pathetic farm. All the good land had been snapped up by the wealthy squatters, men who had built huge private ranches on government land and refused to give it back. The government decided to let them keep it, but with one condition. They had to give back small portions so that poor families like the Kellys could rent it. But the wealthy squatters fought this tooth and nail. They made sure that only the worst farmland came available for selection by the poor families. And of that limited supply, the squatters then reclaimed 2/3 of it by hiring agents who pretended to rent it, only to give it right back once the government stopped looking. And when legitimate selectors, non-rich farmers like the Kelly family, managed to squeeze through all of those obstacles, the squatters did everything they could to drive them to bankruptcy. They impounded their animals, they cut off their water access, they paid police to investigate and even arrest them. This was why police had come to the house to investigate and then arrest Ned's father all those years ago for stealing a cow from a wealthy neighbor, because the police had been paid by that neighbor to do so. Ned's family had moved away from that squatter only to come into range of another one who complained about them so often that he convinced his buddy, the police commissioner, to build a new police station nearby just to keep an eye on them. And he scored a victory when the local constable caught Ned riding a stolen horse. Another squatter had spent the last decade harassing Ned's mother to sell him their farm, and now yet another pair of wealthy squatters set their sights on Ned. They accused him of stealing one of their bulls. When Ned asked them why they had done that, they told him, "Oh, we made a mistake. Turns out that bull had just wandered off. It's back now, though. What a rascal. Bulls, right? Anyway. Annoying, but okay, matter resolved, right? Ned's proved innocent. Everybody can go on their way." Well, no. A few weeks later, the squatters accused Ned of stealing an entire herd of calves. This was the last straw. Ned had so long struggled to make ends meet in a world stacked against him. He had served his time, and then done his best to live an honest life and put the sins of his past behind him. But now, Ned decided that if all these squatters so desperately wanted to make him a criminal, he would become one. And become one he did. Ned masterminded the creation of the biggest horse and cattle thieving ring in Australia. His scheme was brilliantly simple. Once he and his friends had stolen the horses, they would bring them to some remote ranch far from the scene of the crime. Then one of his friends would just happen to pass through, dressed as a rich dandy who also just happened to be interested in buying livestock. The unwitting ranch owner, happy to help such courteous young men, would agree to act as witness, and bam, just like that, suddenly Ned's gang had a legal bill of sale for illegally obtained livestock, and they could turn around and sell those livestock to a real buyer who would never suspect a thing. For Ned, this was no longer a question of feeding his family. This was a matter of revenge, of taking a chunk out of the greedy squatters whose exclusionary land practices and extortionist control of the police had made it impossible for families like his to succeed in the first place. Join us next time as police desperation to catch Ned Kelly reaches fever pitch, and he sets off the chain of events that will make him the most feared man in the country. The rich squatters were in an uproar. Horses and cattle vanished like water through a sieve. It was the Greta mob's doing, a flashy young gang of thieves who had suddenly become organized, unstoppable under the leadership of a 22-year-old named Ned Kelly. The police knew it was him, but they couldn't catch him. No matter how preposterous the number of livestock he sold, he always had a legal bill of sale for them. In desperation, the superintendent of police issued a formal directive. Officers must arrest the members of the Greta mob on any charge, no matter how small, and send them to prison with all the force of the law. That's a very good way of taking the flashness out of them. Ned Kelly certainly had flash. The squatters might have hated him, but the poor farmers who had suffered under their abuse for decades celebrated Ned everywhere he went. There was always somebody eager to buy him a drink when he came to town, and Ned's ill-gotten gains would often go to buy a round for the whole bar so that everybody could celebrate squatter riches turning into drinks. But Ned himself wouldn't indulge. He'd never forgotten the final year of his father's life. He had never forgot watching the man he so admired waste away in a drunken haze, so Ned never got drunk. That is, until one evening in September of 1877. Ned had stopped in for drinks at the local hotel and happened to sit next to a young officer named Alexander Fitzpatrick. A fellow Irishman about Ned's age, Fitzpatrick had only recently joined the police and still had a bit of that scoundrel quality that Ned could not help but like. They bought each other drinks, toasted to each other's health, and the next morning Ned awoke in a haze with a splitting hangover in a prison cell. Fitzpatrick had arrested him outside the bar on charge of public drunkenness. Ned could not believe it. He wasn't a drinker, but he was no lightweight either. It would take more than a beer or two to black him out. Unless someone had drugged him, and Fitzpatrick looked awfully nervous. The young officer had set him up. Ned was sure of it. No doubt Fitzpatrick sought praise for being the man to finally bring in Ned Kelly, for finally taking the flashness out of him. Well, Ned was not going to let Fitzpatrick have that victory. Tearing away from the handcuffs Fitzpatrick tried to put on him, Ned charges into the street. 4 police officers run after him, yelling for passers-by to seize him. Nobody dares, but one brave soul manages to trip Ned and sends him careening into a nearby shop. The officers run after him, and even the shopkeep joins the fray. All 5 jump at him. One officer, desperately trying to get a grip on Ned, accidentally catches the hem of his pants and pulls them down. Another one sees this and thinks, I know what kind of pain would stop any full-grown man in his tracks. And that is when things really get, nuts. Because pain does not stop Ned Kelly. No. Ned roars in fury and throws the officers off him like broken toys. He kicks Fitzpatrick so hard that the young policeman flies into a wall and is knocked unconscious. But the officer who grabbed Ned Kelly's nethers continues to hold on for dear life. The local magistrate, hearing all of this noise, comes in to investigate, and when he sees what is going on, he immediately yells at the officers, "You should be ashamed of yourselves!" They drop off Ned, and he gets to pull his pants up. Feeling vindicated, Ned, limping more than a little at this point, tamely agrees to let the magistrate take charge from here. He allows the magistrate to handcuff him. He goes to his court appointment, gentle as a lamb, and pleads guilty to all charges. He pays his fines on the spot and walks away a legend. As for Fitzpatrick, he was left nursing a headache and a grudge. Since he couldn't really strike at Ned, Fitzpatrick instead took aim at Ned's younger brother, Dan Kelly. Dan was only 16, but he'd been running with his big brother's Greta mob since the beginning. The police had finally tracked one of the illegal horse sales back to Dan and put a warrant out for his arrest. Fitzpatrick decided that he was going to be the man to bring Dan in, so he rode 17 miles out of his way, threw down a few beers to boost his courage, and showed up late one afternoon on the Kellys' doorstep. Ellen Kelly, Ned's mother, wanted none of it. She had watched her siblings, her in-laws, her husband, and now her children dragged before a prejudiced court, and she still carried a grudge over Ned getting 3 years in prison for riding a horse that he hadn't even stolen. She demanded to see a warrant. Fitzpatrick didn't have it with him, so she told him to get the hell out of her house. Fitzpatrick would later claim that she came after him with a shovel. The Kelly family insisted that he started it by pulling his gun on her. Either way, things got heated up fast. Dan leapt for the gun, twisting it out of Fitzpatrick's grasp. At the same moment, Ned drew his own pistol and fired 3 warning shots above the police officer's head. But Fitzpatrick flailed when Dan came after him, and 1 bullet grazed his wrist. The shock hit all of them at once. Ned hurried to make amends, sitting Fitzpatrick down at the table, helping him dig out the bullet with a small knife. Ellen Kelly bandaged the wound, and Dan gave back his gun. Shaken, and not a little scared for his life, Fitzpatrick agreed that it had all been a misunderstanding. He promised not to say a word about what happened, went back to his horse, and rode away. Hours later, in the dead of night, a drunk and disorderly Fitzpatrick barged into the house of a fellow officer and announced, "I've been shot at by Ned Kelly." Word spread like wildfire. At long last, the police had a solid claim against Ned Kelly: attempted murder. They rode like the wind, but Ned and Dan had already been warned. They disappeared into the bush, that great Australian wilderness that lay just on the outskirts of colonial settlements. But their mother hadn't gone anywhere, and after all, she had swung a shovel at a police officer. The police arrested Ellen Kelly with a 2-month-old baby in her arms and dragged her off to prison. When they found out, Ned and Dan grew frantic. They had to remain in hiding, but friends in town helped them hire a lawyer and organize their mother's defense. Alas, it was no good. The court sentenced her to 3 years hard labor. Ned and Dan sent a message offering to give themselves up in exchange for her freedom, but the court would promise no such thing. And why would they? The police had organized search parties to find the missing Kelly brothers. It would only be a matter of time before they caught them. Then all of these criminals would be in jail, and the Greta mob that had so terrorized the region would be leaderless and broken. The first search party embarked with high spirits, full of bravado. They bragged about how they would gun Ned Kelly down on sight, joked loudly about who would get first blood on him. They might not have been so bold if they had realized that Ned Kelly had tracked them to their camp. Ned knew that they wanted to kill him, and he knew that his situation was desperate. His closest friends from the Greta mob had joined him in the bush, but they only had 2 guns between the 4 of them, and the best of those guns was barely held together by wire and string. Ned was the best shot, so he took it. They stalked the police camp and waited until the afternoon shadows grew long. And then the police officers made that classic mistake. They split the party. 2 of them go scouting while the other 2 remain behind to make camp. As soon as he is sure they're alone, Ned steps out of the bushes and shouts, "Bail up! Throw up your hands!" The first man, Constable McIntyre, does so immediately. The other man races for the cover of a nearby log and pulls his own revolver. He peers over the log and takes aim, but Ned pulls a Han Solo. The shot goes right into the officer's eye, giving him just enough time to scream that he's dying. Then he falls. Constable McIntyre, hands still in the air, watches Ned slowly approach the corpse. Ned has never killed a man before, much less a police officer. McIntyre hears him wonder out loud, what made the fool run? But it's done now. Ned Kelly has killed a policeman. And the day is not over yet. There are still 2 more police officers out scouting, and Ned doesn't want to repeat this incident. He promises not to hurt McIntyre. All he really wants is to take the horses and the guns and send this whole search party home empty-handed. They have a chat while Ned's friends search the camp, and McIntyre agrees to help convince the other officers to surrender peacefully. They should be back soon. But when they do return, they do not take kindly to McIntyre's suggestion that they surrender, and they take even less kindly to having Ned's gang point guns at them. After all their bragging about shooting Ned on sight, one officer tries to do exactly that. But he misses, and Ned shoots him off his horse. The other officer fires also, but he knows he's outgunned. He makes a break for the trees, and Ned runs after him. In the commotion, Officer McIntyre grabs a loose horse and takes off at a desperate gallop, leaving the final officer alone to meet his fate at the hands of Ned Kelly. When McIntyre roars back into town with news of the murdered policeman, everything changes for Ned Kelly and his 3 companions. They are no longer the Greta mob. They are the Kelly gang. Night has fallen on the Australian outback. Police search parties roam wide in search of the Kelly gang, the cop killers who fled the scene of their crime 1 week prior. The rain falls heavy, and the river threatens to flood, but a group of officers searches the shore anyway. They spot something. Tracks, perhaps? They pace the riverbank looking for more, but find nothing. At last, they continue on their way. Once the police have gone from sight, 4 men emerge from a nearby clump of reeds, up to their noses in water. Soaking and shivering, their guns waterlogged and useless, the Kelly gang drags themselves back to shore. Just a few more steps to the left, and the police would have found them utterly defenseless. This is the closest anyone will ever get to catching them. With 3 officers dead by his hand, Ned Kelly became a fugitive. The government declared the Kelly gang to be outlaws, offering thousands for their capture and authorizing every citizen to shoot them dead on sight. But no one seemed eager to claim the reward. Sympathizers across the countryside took the gang in, hid them in barns, misdirected any police search parties that came snooping. And any police who did manage to find the Kellys' trail would immediately sprint in the opposite direction, fearing for their life. Several leading officers were censured for their cowardice after blatantly abandoning chance after chance to catch the Kelly gang. But the police faced an uphill battle. Ned was slowly winning the rest of the country to his side. Ned was determined to be a better kind of bushranger, one who never robbed ordinary people. In fact, if the gang ever had to stay the night at somebody's place or eat their food, Ned would pay them back for it. Ned's beef was with the rich squatters and their pet police force, and he was determined that they would be his only victims. At first, the only member of the gang who really understood this was Ned's best friend, Joe Byrne. Everybody had always loved Joe. He was well-dressed, well-spoken, charismatic, and most importantly, smart. In Joe, Ned found a reliable right-hand man who not only understood Ned's intentions, but could help him plan it. And Ned had big plans. The way he saw it, the best way to get back at the squatters and undermine their stranglehold on the region's economy was to hit them where it really hurt, their wallets. And he knew just the place to do it. A sleepy little town with a sleepy little bank called Euroa. He and Joe put their heads together and sketched out a plan. First, they would seize a way station by the railroad stop so that they could easily monitor traffic coming in and out of the area. Then they would destroy the telegraph station to make sure that even if the plan went sour, no one would be able to summon the police in time to stop them. Finally, once they had completely secured the area, then they would rob the bank. On a Monday, December 9th of 1878, Ned rode up to the way station outside Euroa and asked the groom to take his horse. On a whim, he asked, "Do you know who I am?" The old groom glanced up at this rumpled young man and joked, "Perhaps you're Ned Kelly." Ned drew his gun. "You're a damned fine guesser." Ned and his crew rounded up every worker and traveler that passed through the station that day and packed them all into a small locked shed. All except for the women and children, of course. They were put in the more comfortable station house. It was the decent thing to do. The gang executed Ned's plan slowly and methodically. They kept their hostages overnight and even sat down among them to talk and answer questions. Ned was eager to dispel some of the worst myths that had been circulated about him. No, of course he hadn't sawed off dead police officers' ears and fingers for trophies. He'd only fired on those 3 officers in self-defense after they'd tried to shoot him. By now, the hostages greatly outnumbered the Kelly gang, but they didn't dare to turn on them. For one thing, they suspected, and they would have been correct, that Ned had invited a few local sympathizers to come by and pretend to be hostages, so that they could alert him of anyone who might be thinking of trying something stupid. For another, many of the actual hostages found this opportunity to interview a bushranger about his crimes fascinating. And Ned was nothing if not a charming and gracious hostage-taker. Come the next morning, Ned executed the rest of his plan, destroying the telegraph office and robbing the bank. It went off without a hitch. No one had expected them, and they met no real resistance. Ned walked away with well over 2,000 pounds in cash, and just for good measure, he burned every record of debt the bank had, hoping to get a few poor farmers off the hook. He returned to the way station, gave the hostages a small share of the loot to apologize for the trouble, and then rode off with his gang. Ned's legend was growing. As eager newspapers spread the story of Euroa, people began to praise the Kelly gang. One paper even suggested that the Australian police force should be rebuilt with men like them, hardy, self-made Australian natives who treated civilians with courtesy and weren't afraid to dive into the thick of danger to confront problems. The Kelly gang made fools of the police, whose disorganized search parties never managed to even catch sight of the gang, and had even once shot at each other in confusion. Disgraced and humiliated, the police began cracking down on suspected Kelly sympathizers, throwing them in jail. But they had no real evidence against anybody. They barely even knew who their suspects were, and they arrested the wrong people several times. The sight of police parading these innocent everyday people through the streets in handcuffs did nothing to scare Kelly's sympathizers. If anything, it only further convinced them that Ned Kelly was right. The police were crooked and incompetent, and willing to throw anybody in jail to protect their rich squatter friends. More and more citizens began to take Ned Kelly's side, and support for him became so widespread that the entire area became known as Kelly Country. As the months dragged on, the spectacle of arrested sympathizers only grew worse. Time after time, the sympathizers would go to court and demand a trial, only to be denied as the court found every excuse to delay. The police knew that at least some of these people were helping the Kelly gang, but a trial with no evidence would only set them free to do it again. When the official prosecutor voiced concerns about this, he was promptly fired. But then, a few days later, he returned to the case, now defending Kelly's sympathizers. Ned had hired him with the money he stole from Euroa, and thus scored another popular victory for his cause. The last of the sympathizers would finally be released without charges after 107 days in prison. Not all the common folk were Kelly fans, though. A journalist in the town of Jerilderie remained steadfast in his opposition to the gang. He wrote an article scolding the police for not taking bank security more seriously. His own town had only 2 policemen defending it. How could they be expected to defend the local bank from 4 infamous bushrangers? 1 month after its publication, 4 young police officers showed up to reinforce Jerilderie. It would seem that his article had hit home. Turns out, it had, just not with the people he had intended. In his effort to whip the police into action, he had given Ned perfect scouting information on Jerilderie's vulnerability. Seizing on this easy target, Ned had snuck into town, caught the 2 local police officers by surprise, and locked them up in their own jail cell. Then he and his gang had borrowed uniforms and spent a day casually strolling about the town, casing the area. Their plan was the same as last time: destroy the telegraph station, set up a secure staging area with hostages, and then take the bank. Ned had picked a nearby hotel and left Joe Byrne and his brother Dan in charge of guarding it, making hostages of any passers-by to keep them from entering the bank. With that settled, Ned and the last gang member, Steve Hart, entered the bank. To the surprise of everyone involved, they find the bank manager in a back room, tucked inside a small metal tub, taking his afternoon bath. At gunpoint, the manager agrees to give them the key to the safe after he finishes his bath. Listen, he really wants this bath. Ned, amused by this, assigns Steve to supervise while he goes back out front. Steve has never quite understood Ned's strange insistence on being well-behaved bushrangers, and resentful over having to watch this guy take his stupid bath, he steals the manager's watch in retribution. Once the bath is concluded, the bank heist goes well. Another 2,000 pounds are collected, the debt records are destroyed, and the gang returns to the hotel to buy their hostages a round of drinks before letting them go. As Ned is about to leave, however, a friend of the bank manager stops him and accuses Steve of stealing the watch. Ned is outraged. He reclaims the watch and starts to return it, but no, he hands it back to Steve and orders him, "Give it back to him yourself like a man." Steve obeys. With his gang's honor restored, Ned jumps on his horse, waves his hat in farewell, and rides off to the cheers of his own former hostages. It would be 17 whole months before the public saw Ned Kelly again, but during that time, he began formulating his most ambitious and deadly plan yet, one that he hoped would sow the seeds of an all-out war against the police. It would prove to be his final showdown. On the night that Ned Kelly arrived in Glenrowan to begin his final showdown, Joe Byrne and Dan Kelly were miles away, preparing to commit murder. They had come to the house of Joe Byrne's childhood friend, once an ally of the Kelly gang. He had been passing information to the police, and however ineffective this had been at actually getting them caught, it was a betrayal that Joe could not forgive. They also knew that 4 policemen had been assigned to guard the house, but they didn't care. When the informant answered the door, Joe Byrne shot him right in front of his pregnant wife and her mother. The cops, hiding in the bedroom, were too scared to show themselves. Turning their backs on the corpse, Joe and Dan galloped to rejoin Ned at Glenrowan. It had been a cold, brutal execution, but it was all in service to the plan, carefully calculated. Ned Kelly was tired of hiding. He was tired of being chased, and even more tired of running. He wanted to make his stand against the police. When word got out that Joe and Dan had shot the informant, Ned knew that the police would summon their special train and come racing to catch them. But Ned had set a trap for them along the way. He had prepared for every possibility. Over the last few months, he had collected the blades from farmers' plows and painstakingly reshaped them into heavy armor that could stop a bullet. Clad in their armor, the 4 of them looked like knights, heroes from the stories that he'd grown up on. And if it came to a shootout, they could stand their ground. But Ned did not intend for the police to live that long. To reach the scene of Joe's crime, the special police train would have to pass through the station at Glenrowan. Normally, the tracks leading up Glenrowan turned and then ran alongside a small cliff, but Ned had removed the tracks at the turn. When the police train came speeding along, it would fly straight off of the cliff and crash at full speed. Then Ned and his gang would come along in their full-plate armor to shoot any surviving officers where they lay. Here was the hard steel beneath the charming bushranger. Ned felt wronged. From the day he had left home, running from Fitzpatrick's accusation of attempted murder, he had called himself a forced outlaw and blamed the police for putting him in this position. Now that burning sense of injustice had grown to a full firestorm, and if Ned was troubled by the grim purpose that had brought him here, he didn't show it. As with both of his bank robberies, Ned collected hostages and began to store them in the local inn, treating them to a night of music and dance as the hours stretched by waiting for the special police train. But the hours kept on ticking, past night into morning. Where was the train? Ned had underestimated the cowardice of the police. The 4 officers who had witnessed the informant's murder had hid inside that house until noon. Once they finally reported in, their superiors spent hours deciding what to do and who to bring to chase the Kelly gang again. Night had fallen on the 2nd day before the police train finally started down the track. But as they approached Glenrowan and that final fatal turn, the train's guard noticed something strange. A man stood next to the tracks, waving a red scarf in front of a candle to get their attention. Just a few hours before, this man had been a hostage of the Kelly gang and learned about their plan. He had pretended to be a sympathizer and convinced Ned to let him go home, but instead, he ran to the railroad to warn the police about the trap ahead. Now the police knew everything. They rushed to catch the Kelly gang at the inn. The Kelly gang opened fire, and the siege of Glenrowan began. Bullets flew from every side. Most bounced off of Ned's armor, but 2 shots hit his unprotected hand and foot, crippling him in the first volley. And many more bullets missed entirely, tearing through the walls of the inn where the hostages were hiding. Somebody cried for the police to stop shooting, there were women and children inside, and a brief pause fell while hostages trickled out of the inn. But the police feared that the Kelly gang might use the hostages as a cover for their own escape, and fired when they heard a male voice coming from one group. It was just a family with a teenage boy. The family fled back inside, and the hostages became too terrified to leave for fear that the police would mistake them for the Kellys again. But Ned had already escaped. In the dark, bleeding heavily and limping from his wounds, he had found a gap in the police lines and crept past them to the trees. But he couldn't leave his friends. He resolved to go back and lead them out through the path that he'd found. Joe Byrne had been holding down the fort while Ned was gone, trying desperately to keep the hostages from falling into despair. When he saw Ned come through the door, he tried to lift their spirits with a loud toast to the Kelly gang. The police heard the sound and fired at it. A bullet hit Joe's leg and struck a major artery. Within seconds, Joe was dead. Watching his best friend die from across the room, Ned descended into a fury. He rushed in and out of the house, roaring at the police to fight him. But they wouldn't. He looked for Dan and Steve, but couldn't find them. They must have abandoned him. He crept back through the police lines, retracing his secret escape path, but still saw no sign of his friends. He started to go back one more time to look for them, before finally collapsing from blood loss. When Ned wakes back up, morning has dawned. A heavy fog rolls across the countryside, obscuring everything. He could run. He could make it to the horses and escape through the mist, but no. He came to Glenrowan to make his stand against the police, and stand he will. He's bleeding and limping, he can barely aim his own gun, but this ends today. He limps around the police lines and surprises them from the rear. To the tired officers, Ned Kelly seems like a demon. He's inhumanly tall, shrouded by mist, with his face hidden behind a metal mask. They fire at him, but their shots bounce off harmlessly. He strides into the thick of the group, firing back. Dan and Steve emerge from their hiding places in the inn and join the shooting. Still, Ned marches forward. He taunts the police. They can't hit him. And the more they try, the more he laughs. For half an hour, Ned trudges through the hail of police bullets. But as the morning mist rolls away, one officer finally realizes that the armor doesn't cover Ned's legs. His next shot blows through Ned's kneecap, and at long last, the Iron Outlaw falls to the ground. Ned surrenders. The officer takes aim again. He swore that he would be the man to kill Ned Kelly, and now he has his chance. But before he can pull the trigger, another policeman steps in the way and declares, "I will shoot any bloody man that dares touch him." Ned recognizes that voice. It's Constable Bracken, the officer Ned had taken hostage here in Glenrowan just the night before. Bracken had escaped when the siege began, and now found himself defending the same man who had dragged him out of his sickbed, put a gun in his face, and threatened to kill him. But no matter what Ned had done, Bracken insisted he deserved a fair trial. Dan and Steve would not be so lucky. They allowed the last of the hostages to go, but refused to let themselves be captured. After trading a few more volleys with the police, the two of them took their own lives. The police, not realizing that the two were already dead, decided to end the siege by burning down the building. Ned Kelly got his trial, but it did little to help him. His sister tried desperately to organize a legal defense, but she couldn't afford a good lawyer. The money from Ned's bank robberies was long gone. The jury returned a guilty verdict, and the judge sentenced him to death. Nearly 10,000 people marched in protest, and a petition to stop his execution gathered 60,000 signatures, but the government refused to change the court's sentence. Ned Kelly would hang. On November 11th, 1880, Ned Kelly walked into the gallows. From then on, Australians would look to him as either a sign of rebellion and freedom, or of lawlessness and crime, of the fight against tyranny, or the very thing they needed authority to protect them against. But Ned, he just looked at that noose that had been prepared for him, sighed, and said, "Such is life."
But if they cross and check my path by